In a setback for NATO and Ukraine, major Latin American nations have refused to send weapons to Kyiv in its fight against Moscow. Just a few weeks back, America made key partners like Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia an offer. If the three Latin American powers would hand their aging Soviet-era weaponry to Ukraine, America would replace these arms with modern Western replacements. However, all three countries have strongly refused to aid Kyiv in its war against Moscow, despite the fact that all three countries have historically been major partners of NATO. Even if they end up as scrap in Colombia, we will not hand over Russian weapons to be taken to Ukraine to prolong the war, Colombia's left-wing president Gustavo Petro said. He added, "We are not with either side, we are for peace." Brazil's president Lula Inácio da Silva echoed that sentiment. Brazil has no interest in passing on munitions to be used in the war between Ukraine and Russia. Brazil is a country of peace. At this moment, we need to find those who want peace, a word that has so far been used very little. Neighboring Argentina also took a similar line. Argentina is not going to cooperate with the war. It is not appropriate to cooperate by sending arms to the conflict in Europe. To understand why this is a setback for the West and Ukraine, we have to take a look at Latin America's relationship with Russia and its position on the Ukraine war. When the invasion of Ukraine began on February 24th last year, the vast majority of the region's countries, including Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia, voted to condemn Russia's military action against Ukraine in the United Nations. Most Latin American states have supported Ukraine because of a strong diplomatic tradition that gives importance to non-intervention and self-determination. The continent, which fought for its independence against European colonizers, has a strong political tradition of respecting state sovereignty. However, despite this political support, major Western partners like Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina are unhappy with the West's policy of imposing crippling sanctions on Ukraine. All three countries seem to believe that the West's sanctions have worsened a conflict that has significantly hurt them. Increases in the price of fertilizer and energy because of the war have caused significant pain to the three Latin American countries. In March, Argentina's Foreign Minister Santiago Cafiero argued that the use of sanctions would not be efficient for achieving peace. This perspective was further promoted in May when Brazil attempted to pass an amendment on a UN resolution which highlighted the negative impacts of the sanctions on Russia on the global food supply. This was ultimately vetoed by the United States. None of the three countries has imposed sanctions on Russia. Besides unhappiness with the West, all three major Latin American countries do not wish to endanger their relationship with Moscow by sending weapons to Ukraine. For many of these states, economic relations with Russia are essential due to a high dependency on Russian fertilizers required for their agribusiness sectors. Brazil is the largest producer and exporter of products like soybeans and must import 85% of its fertilizers needs. 23% of those come from Russia. Moscow also enjoys strong support among a number of Latin American nations like Cuba and Venezuela, which makes it a power to watch out for. Finally, the three nations, along with much of the continent, have some sympathy with Russia's geopolitical position. To many in the region, the expansion of NATO eastwards throughout the 1990s towards Russia's borders posed a security threat to Moscow. As such, there is some degree of understanding, if not sympathy, for why Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. President Lula of Brazil articulated that sentiment in an interview he gave before winning the country's presidential election. Putin shouldn't have invaded Ukraine. But it's not just Putin who's guilty. The US and the European Union are also guilty. What was the reason for the Ukraine invasion? NATO? Then the US and Europe should have said Ukraine won't join NATO. That would have solved the problem. He went on to add, "Sometimes I sit and watch the president of Ukraine speaking on television, being applauded, and getting a standing ovation by all the parliamentarians. This guy is as responsible as Putin for the war. Because in the war, there's not just one person guilty." For the West, this represents another failure in its effort to get nations from the developing world to back its military and sanctions policy on Russia. Major partners like India and now even NATO-friendly powers like Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia are choosing to break with the West and follow an independent line on the Ukraine war. That speaks volumes about the declining influence of the West globally, even as it fights to win the war on the battlefields of Ukraine.